Ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. This starts the second half of our morning session, and we continue to look at the future of the European Union. After having heard views from Germany and from the United Kingdom, it is now my distinct privilege to welcome the President of the Commission of the European Union. It's really a wonderful pleasure to have you here. And I should say that President Juncker is not the only representative of the EU Commission. I'm really delighted to see that not only my fellow German Günther Oettinger is here, but along with him, 3 or 4 or 5 other members of the EU Commission, which is a wonderful sign of interest and active participation. Without further ado, Mr. President, let me invite you to address this audience. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Grüß Gott und
Grüß Gott, as they say in Bavaria, and good morning. Wolfgang Ischinger told me I had 10 to 15 minutes available now, and he knows very well that I usually need this amount of time to start the beginning of my introduction. But since he's the big boss here, I will, of course, give in to his desires and be a subject to his violent dictatorship here. I would like to make some introductory remarks today, and then I wanted to talk to Wolfgang Ischinger and all of you. First of all, I would like to welcome you very warmly here. I see so many friends in this room, so that I would rather not like to begin to enumerate all of those friends. Some of you might be surprised that I count you and consider you to be my friends, but I'm very pleased to be here. And I wanted to talk about Europe, about European defense and foreign policy. I wanted to talk about initiatives that we launched and that we wanted to launch. And I would like to report to you on all that. The fact of the matter is that the European Union and its predecessors, the European Economic Community, were not geared towards politics in the field, in the world. We, for a long time, were not prepared for world politics. And the circumstances require that we need to look into becoming active in world and international politics, and that rings particularly true for defense. Over the past few years, we have made more progress than in the 20 years before that. We have undertaken countless efforts, and good morning, Mr. Prime Minister, by the way. So, during the last decades, there have been many efforts geared towards that, but there had not been any considerable progress. But now there is progress, and these advances are necessary, and the numbers speak for themselves. Only few Europeans are aware of the fact that in Europe we have about 170,000 types of weapons. Our American friends only have 30. We have 20 aircraft types in Europe. In the US, it's only 6. We have 17 tanks in Europe. In the US, only 1 model of tank that's being used. In Europe, there are more helicopter manufacturers than we have governments that could potentially buy all those helicopters. And I could continue this list. And therefore, I think it is necessary for European defense policy, and especially for procurement, to be more efficient. Our American partners spend twice the amount of what the European Union defense efforts spend on defense, and still the Europeans are much more efficient than their American partners. So we need to simplify our procurement system and improve it. We have already made proposals in that regard, and I am determined to implement those proposals. Until now, when it comes to research, we have invested 90 million euros for 2018 and 2019. That's funds we allocated for this time period, and this amount is much higher than what we've spent before. By 2020, we want to spend 590 million euros and then 1.5 billion euros per year, so that we get an efficient increase in our budgets. And the member states also need to get involved. 80% of the military research spending is happening at purely national level, and 90% of our investment in equipment happens at national level. And we have to increase our efficiency across borders and make our procurement system in the European Union much more effective. It's not without a surprise that I've read that people on the other side of the Atlantic think that the EU would become too independent when it comes to defense matters and security policy. Yes, we do want to emancipate ourselves, but we do not do that against NATO, against the United States of America. I still think that NATO is a project that we need to stick to also in the interest of future generations. Over many years, we have been accused by the Americans that we wouldn't be doing enough for our own defense. But now we do make efforts, we do more, and now they are not happy with that either. Either one thing was right and the other one's correct, and the wrong and the other one is wrong, or the other one's correct. Well, we do more because we have to do more, but we cannot rely on allies alone. We have to do something ourselves in order to protect our security interests, and we want to do that. But that does not take place in an effort against NATO. The European Treaty sets out that NATO and the EU need to be complementary, and they will continue to be that, complementary. But if we want to be able to act in international politics, we need to simplify our decision-making processes, and we need to standardize them. Things can't stay as they are, even though many foreign ministers see it that way. As, for example, my former foreign minister, Mr. Asselborn, whom I welcome as well. We can't have it that we always need unanimity in security and foreign policy. This need for unanimity stops us from being able to interact in international politics. Time and again, we see that we are not able to come to a unanimous decision. The European Union does not come to a unified position when it comes to the issues in the South China Sea, or when it comes to human rights in the People's Democratic Republic of China, or when it comes to the Eurozone question. And this is why we need to make our decision-making processes much easier. We need to be able to work with a qualified majority in the European Union. I said this in my speech on the occasion of the State of the Union in the European Parliament, and the Commission also handed in proposals in that regard. And that does not require an amendment to the treaties, but instead you can go back to Article 31 of the Treaty on the European Union, of the Lisbon Treaty, because this treaty says that the European Council can make a unanimous decision on where and in what matters it needs a unanimous decision. And that's the development we want to enter into, especially when it comes to defense missions. We will never be able to make a unanimous decision on deploying soldiers, especially when it comes to Germany, because Germany has a parliamentary army with a parliamentary reservation. But we want to be a bit softer in these issues when it comes to foreign policy. This is why we need the qualified majority. However, one principle still applies. Soft power is sometimes not powerful enough. We need to use more power when it comes to common defense and foreign and security policy. First of all, we need to bring our own house in order. And I do not want to go into too much detail, but I would like to elaborate on the West Balkans for a bit. In February and early March, I will travel the 6 West Balkan countries. And I am interested, I'm looking forward to this trip, and I think that I was right for once when in 2014 I declared in the European Parliament while the mandate was still in place until 2019 that there will be no additional members of the EU that will be accessing. That led to a lot of frustration in the Western Balkans. Had I said in 2014 that by 2019 the 6 Western Balkan countries will become members of the EU, I wouldn't know what I would have to report on this matter today. Nothing, basically, because the Western Balkan countries are not yet able, at this point at least, to become members of the EU. But what matters is this: the West Balkan countries have maintained a European Union perspective. Had they been robbed of this view, of this perspective towards the EU, they could overnight face conflicts that we have seen in this region in the early 90s. This is a very sensitive, very delicate region of Europe, and we need to be aware of the responsibility we bear there. And with the accession perspective for these countries, we export stability instead of importing instability from the Western Balkans into the European Union. The prerequisite, however, is this: the Western Balkan countries need to settle their border conflicts before they become members of the EU. Currently, I suffer when I look at this Slovenian-Croatian border conflict, and I believe that the question could have been clarified before Slovenia and Croatia had entered the EU. But instead, an international arbitrary court was charged with that, but the parties cannot agree on how to settle and this argument, deal with the verdict of this court. And that's why I think the conflicts in the Balkans need to be solved before these countries enter the European Union. I can see in my friend Wolfgang's face that I need to thank you now for your willingness to listen to me for so long. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you for this very interesting statement. We do have time for a few questions now. Please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. Who is the first one to ask a question? Please go ahead. Sometimes it takes a while. Oh, back there, I see somebody raising their hand. Could we maybe hand down a mic to the person in the back?
Introduce yourself as if you want to ask a question. Thank you very much. This is Frank Wisner. I know your face, Frank. Please.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I listened very carefully to your excellent remarks on the crisis or the emerging difficulties Europe faces in the Western Balkans. I've also read very carefully the Commission's report on February 7, in which the Commission lays out a very strong strategy to deal with problems in the region. My question to you, sir, is as follows. Don't the prospects of success of an EU strategy in the Balkans improve measurably if you conduct that policy in close coordination between the EU and NATO and between EU and the United States? If there is one lesson that I take away from the crisis of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, if it is just one hand working, the Balkans proves to be an intractable object?
I do think that we have good reasons to organize our relations with the Western Balkan countries together with NATO and together with the United States of America. I know how difficult these relations were at the beginning of the 90s. I'm referring to the Dayton process and to others, but I do think that it's our common responsibility to act together. But the decision, if and when Western Balkan member states could and should join the European Union, is an exclusive European one.
I'm looking around. Karl Kaiser. Microphone.
Karl Kaiser, Harvard University. Mr. Juncker, we heard a very interesting statement by the British Prime Minister with lots of very productive and constructive proposals on security cooperation between the European Union and the Britain outside. My question to you is there a linkage between that and all the other conditions that you yourself and the European Union have formulated for Britain to take part in the economic union or in the economic market? Does that change the situation with regard to your conditions of the future relationship between Britain outside and the European Union?
With your permission, can we take one more? Herr Bütikofer.
President Juncker,
President Juncker, Sigmar Gabriel, this morning in his speech, highlighted that, according to his opinion, the EU should not only react naively to the Chinese attempts to conduct the One Belt, One Road project in order to create a new China-centric world order, but instead be proactive and create connectivity and links and export that beyond Eastern Europe into Central Asia. And that should include European funds and should be supported by them. Do you share that opinion? And how could we make that happen? Well, first of all, that is my opinion, too. We cannot give in to and be subject to Chinese plans and ideas, and therefore we need to use money and be able to use money of the European budget for that. But giving a quantitative answer to your questions would be too early, because we're currently in a process of finding a response to that, also when it comes to our EU budget. And when we come back to that term, being able to act in international politics, if we want to do that, we also need to embark on a path here in that matter. But we need to be cautious. We must not underestimate what the Chinese are doing. We see that Europe is a continent that is open for China, and at the same time, we see too that China has an economy in its own country that is not that open. Why is that the case? Well, the Commission suggested to review Chinese investments in Europe, whether they contain a threat potential. This is a process of approaching each other that has been going on for the last decade. Regarding the question of security policy and security policy commonalities between the EU and the UK, I would like to say that I believe, since we are not at war with the UK and since we do not want to take revenge on the UK for what the British people has decided, so this security alliance, the security bridge between the UK and the EU, will be maintained. We still need it. However, you cannot mix up this question with other questions that are important in the context with Brexit. You have to look at them individually, and you have to answer question by question, matter by matter. But I do not want to mix up security policy considerations with other considerations. I understand why some people want to do that, but we do not want to mix up several issues. Thank you very much. We have time for 2 more questions that we also combine with each other. Claudia Roth has a question, and then Franz Josef Jung. I'm happy to see you, Mr. Juncker. Yesterday, we had a very interesting side event dealing with security and environment and climate change and climate crisis. And in this panel, that was the first time that a panel like that was held at this conference. My question is, the reality is that 26 million people have lost everything, their home, for example, due to climate change. What role could and should Europe play in that, and could the European Union play in that as a role model and trailblazer in order to really implement the Paris Agreement and not to just merely sign it, which some governments have done? And what can we do to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in order to reach something positive for the development of our planet? And now Franz Josef Jung. President Juncker, you, quite rightly so, highlighted the positive developments in the defense capabilities of Europe. There's progress that we made in the last years. And also you mentioned the cooperation with NATO, and I would like to make a distinction between the French-German proposal on headquarters and the command structure. And I hear concerns from the US regarding the buildup of such a command structure. I have to say, however, that we have gained our own experience. We had an EU Congo mission, we had EU Atalanta mission fighting piracy, and we coordinated closely with NATO, and we consciously made it an EU mission. And if you make an EU mission, you also need a good command structure for that. And this is why this is not geared against NATO, but it's enhancing the defense capabilities of Europe in cooperation with NATO. And that is why I think we need to highlight that in the entire discussion. Do you agree with me on that one in this analysis? And would you reiterate that as well? I have never dared to contradict you, Franz Josef. When it comes to a joint command, we have to work together with NATO and find an appropriate structure that helps our European missions. I do not want to be left in the dark here or in a gray zone between EU and NATO somewhere when it comes to that matter. I believe, though, that we need to engage in a direct dialogue with our American friends and partners, and that we will be able to achieve that. Regarding the question by Claudia Roth, I would like to say that, to me, climate policy, peace and security, it is basically peace and security policy with different means. More people die today from environmental damage caused by humankind as they do in dying from wars and conflicts. Just sitting by idly and watching how climate develops and unfolds and how climate influences all the problems in the world, it's morally not allowed. In the talks with our American friends, I learned that the Paris Agreement needs to be implemented completely. Europe is not only an invention for itself. We need to stop just looking at our domestic European issues. Europe is also an offer to the world. And since Europe is this offer to the world, the allies also run the risk of falling victim to climate change. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much for joining us. It was the first time for you as the President of the Commission to join us here at the Munich Security Conference. I hope that we can develop this into a tradition. Thank you very much Mr. President, and please give a hand of applause to the President. And while we say goodbye to him, I would like to ask the two Prime Ministers, who are the next speakers, to join me on stage. Thank you.